These denomination origin charts have at least one big thing that they all seem to get wrong, or at least the charts make it unclear, and so it can be deceiving. Even Wikipedia's chart has this issue. Before we go back and look at one of the major divisions in Christianity, let's come to relatively recent times to notice an issue with talking about the origin of denominations. Here's a pretty new denomination. It's called Sovereign Grace Churches, and it was formed in 1982 as a charismatic denomination and eventually came to hold Calvinistic views as well. It had some name changes and some controversy, but the reason I bring up SGC is that you can definitely say that it's new. It kind of sprang out of the ground. If you look before the 1970s and try to find it, you'll see that it's not there. So on Wikipedia, for example, it's clearly listed that 1982 is the origin. Meanwhile, if you go to Wikipedia and look up the Presbyterian Church USA, you'll find that it is 1 year newer. The origin is listed as June 10, 1983, the year after Sovereign Grace's founding. So if you want to attend the more historic of these two denominations, you should go to SGC, right? Well, I think many of you know the answer to that. The Presbyterian Church USA is full of old churches, or at least old ones as Americans think of old, and this is because what happened in 1983 is that a Presbyterian denomination, which had mostly southern U.S. churches, the Presbyterian Church in the United States, and a Presbyterian denomination that had churches across the USA called the United Presbyterian Church in the United States of America, merged together to make the Presbyterian Church USA. In reality, 1983 is not the origin of this denomination per se, as much as it is a reunification. Presbyterians who went through various controversies and came out divided finally came back together. One thing that makes the discussion of denomination origins controversial is that in many Christian traditions it is viewed as either necessary or at least highly desirable to have a long pedigree. If your denomination has a 1,000-year history, that's more credible than a 50-year one. In addition, for many of those who believe this, it's all or nothing. Either your church has a history back to Christ and the apostles, or your chopped liver. But we'll discuss that a bit more later. So let's say that you like the idea of being a Presbyterian, but you don't want a denomination that just appeared on the scene yesterday. How do you determine what's a new denomination and what's an old one? For example, is the Presbyterian Church USA new when it has churches that have just followed the mergers and never left a denomination in 200 years? Presbyterianism lies in the Protestant Reformation and became the name of churches in the Reformed tradition in Scotland. Often they hold to the Westminster Confession of Faith, though they have changed it a few times. The Westminster Confession was originally written in England for the Church of England in 1646, but that's a long story. Presbyterians came to America and formed into a church body called the Presbyterian Church in the United States of America in 1789. In 1958, it merged with another group of Presbyterians called the United Presbyterian Church of North America, forming the United Presbyterian Church in the United States of America, which, as I already said, merged with the PCUS to form the PCUSA. The question then is, does the denomination become new every time it merges? The mergers themselves were never due to wholesale changes in doctrine or polity, but simply reunifications and mending of broken relationships. So is a church in the PCUSA able to say that their denomination dates to 1983, or can they claim 1958? Or 1789. And the formation of the U.S. body in 1789 is just because Presbyterians came to the New World, so perhaps a church in the PCUSA should be able to claim heritage back to the formation of the Westminster Confession in 1646, or perhaps even further back. But maybe you say no. 1983 is the year that it became a new denomination, so PCUSA churches have a pedigree that's quite recent. For you, I'll give another example. Let's look at the Church of the Nazarene. Wikipedia and denominational sources give 1908 as the denomination's origin. At that time, they were called the Pentecostal Church of the Nazarene, but they changed to Church of the Nazarene in 1919. But they too had mergers. For example, in 1952, the International Holiness Church merged with them. But unlike the Presbyterians, the Church of the Nazarene didn't change their name when the merger happened. In 1955, they merged with the Calvary Holiness Church, and again, nothing changed. The smaller denomination just merged into them. So what's functionally the difference between the Presbyterian mergers and the Nazarene mergers? In both cases, two denominations merge, but the Presbyterians choose to restart the clock and launch a so-called new denomination when they merged, and the Nazarenes just let the two slide together. For the Methodists, in 1968, the Methodist Church and the Evangelical United Brethren Church merged, and they restarted the clock and took the name the United Methodist Church. So everyone is told that the UMC started in 1968. But if the denominations wanted to, they could have simply both taken the name the Methodist Church and let the EUB Church merge in and keep their starting date as 1939. Of course, even that start date was a merger, so if they wouldn't have renamed and made a big fuss then, they could claim to be the same denomination that existed in 1784. I mean, it's worked for the Southern Baptist Convention, right? They're old in United States terms, existing since 1845. If they had merged with some other denomination, would that ruin their age-based credibility? And when in 1934 the Evangelical Synod of North America and Reformed Church in the U.S. decided to merge, a tiny minority of churches said they would keep the old name, and so the RCUS still exists today, claiming an origin of 1725, although they are much more conservative than the denomination as a whole was in 1934 before the merger. So that's the foundation for this discussion then. One response might be that the individual denomination origin doesn't matter so much as the tradition matters. So who cares about the different subgroups of Presbyterians? Let's just look at the first one and call that the date. An oft-repeated copy pasta called How Old Is Your Church says, if you are a Lutheran, your religion was founded by Martin Luther, an ex-monk of the Catholic Church in the year 1517. If you belong to the Church of England, your religion was founded by King Henry VIII in the year 1534 because the Pope would not grant him a divorce with the right to remarry. If you are a Presbyterian, your religion was founded by John Knox in Scotland in the year 1560. If you are a Congregationalist, your religion was originated by Robert Brown in Holland in 1582. It continues right down the line to, if you are Roman Catholic, you know that your religion was founded in the year 33 by Jesus Christ, the Son of God, and it is still the same church. Of course, there are variants too, where the same thing is adapted, but the last two paragraphs say, if you are a Roman Catholic, your church shared the same rich apostolic and doctrinal heritage as the Orthodox Church for the first 1,000 years of its history, since during the first millennium they were one and the same church. Lamentably, in 1054, the Pope of Rome broke away from the other four apostolic patriarchates, which include Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem, by tampering with the original creed of the church, and considering himself the head of the entire Christian church, thus placing himself equal to Jesus Christ. Your church is 1,000 years old. If you are an Orthodox Christian, your religion was founded in the year 33 by Jesus Christ, the Son of God. If you're familiar with the history of the churches that today go by Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church, you know that in 1054 AD there was a schism, and prior to this they were in fellowship and considered to be one church. These two endings to the when your denomination started copy pasta show a contradictory take on who has the rightful claim to be the true heir of that earlier heritage. What's interesting is that in many of the denomination charts around today, there's no ruling on this issue. Rather than showing one or the other splitting, there's simply a fork and two new groups coming out of it. However, many would not make the claim that both Catholics and Orthodox are totally new as of 1054, though this is one of the views a person could have about the schism. More often, you'll hear that either Catholics are the original church and the Orthodox split from them, like this Catholic design chart shows, or Orthodox were original and Catholics split from them, like this chart shows. And this brings me to the one big thing that I find wrong with most denomination charts. It's that all divisions are shown as being equal, when they most definitely present quite differently. So let's take the Orthodox and Catholic division. In this division, the two sides had existed for hundreds of years prior. On the one side was the Patriarchate of Rome, an internal church government structure, and on the other side, in part, was the Patriarchate of Constantinople. When the split occurred, congregations didn't have to align into new structures. All the same bishops were still in place. In fact, most laypersons weren't even aware that anything changed. The churches that were on the one side or the other cut along geographical lines, so it wasn't like suddenly there was an Orthodox church in one city and a Catholic church in the next city over. Rather, if you lived in one area, everything looked the same, but your church and those nearby were Orthodox, and in all likelihood you would never see a church under the Patriarchate of Rome in your life. Meanwhile, the Catholics would be in the same situation. Nothing changed, no parishioners or even priests decided which side of the split to be on. Suddenly, you were just out of communion with another patriarchate you had been in communion with up until this point. People that lived, in most cases, a long way away from you that you would never see. For theological and polemical purposes of determining who is the true church, this will be described as a split, with one side often saying that the Orthodox left the true church and the other that the Catholics did. But if you leave the theological claims aside for a moment, it's easy to see that nearly everyone who actually attended these churches, as well as the ministers who guided them from both sides, had no intention of splitting from anything. So are splits always this way? Far from it. When the Protestant Reformation began, the stated goal of many was to, as the name implies, reform the church, not to divide it. However, as time went on and it became apparent that the Catholic Church was less than enthusiastic about some of these reforms, Protestants were content to leave the structures of the existing church. Now, they did not claim to leave the Catholic, that is, the universal church, but rather claimed that the true Catholic Church transcended the structure of the church, with the Pope at the top. They would be part of a different structure, but the claim was that the true church can contain many church structures within it. These structures would come to be known as denominations. The rise of Lutheranism in Germany was not as quiet as the sudden switch between being part of a united Orthodox Catholic Church to just one side was in 1054. There were not churches that were already aligned to the Lutheran side for centuries. There were no existing Lutheran structures. Rather, there was an uprising of the people, there was wrestling for political control, and new Lutheran church government structures were built to compete with the ones that still aligned with Rome. Everyone was well aware of the fight going on, including the lay people, and in fact they often spearheaded it. And not only this, but when people became Lutherans, this came with changes to church doctrine and practice as well. It simply cannot be said that the kind of split between Catholic and Orthodox is the exact same thing as the split between Lutheran and Catholic. So what of the other splits? Anglicanism is interesting because it looks more like 1054 than Lutheranism does. The church structures already existed, the Church of England. Churches and their bishops and parishioners were under the Pope one day and weren't the next. And at the beginning at least, there were no changes to the practice of the church. But once there was a split from Rome's authority, over time the changes began to come. And Methodism, which split from Anglicanism, is different still. Methodism was a reform movement of sorts, and Methodist societies weren't even churches at first. People attended the Methodist Society and went to the Anglican Church for the Eucharist. But eventually, the tense arrangement broke and the Methodists were excommunicated. So let's look back at Wikipedia's chart. Notice that for the East-West Schism, they show a two-way fork and don't assign the church to either side before the split. Now consider two earlier schisms in the church. One is the Oriental Orthodox churches exiting at the Council of Chalcedon, and the other is the Church of the East doing so at the Council of Ephesus. Why are these two shown to leave the church, which continues on, instead of being shown as a two-way split like is done in 1054? For example, in the case of the split at Calcedon, the Church of Alexandria was one that broke communion with the others. People continued to attend their same congregations and believe the same things that they had believed before. The bishops, priests, and membership didn't intend to split from any church. They intended to simply continue in their same church structures and break fellowship with the others who called them heretics. So is it the charge of heresy that has led them to be shown as these schismatics on the chart and denied them the deference of a two-way split? Or is it their size? Or is it just a case of the charts being drawn from a Calcedonian perspective, and a theological claim has influenced the chart making even on Wikipedia? Now don't get me wrong, theological claims should influence the chart making. After all, if the true church is actually the Orthodox all the way down, why shouldn't they draw their chart that way? Or if it's the Church of Christ, then they can draw their charts to show that. Or if it's the Baptists, then their chart can put them as the original church. Or maybe it's the Lutherans that should have the chart focus on them. As you can see, these charts can be deceiving. They tell a narrative, and if you have the desire to, you can draw a chart to make you the original church, no matter how far that is from the truth. But as I said, if you believe that your church really is the original one, then you should be able to draw your chart that way. We should just be willing to also apply a healthy dose of skepticism to any chart when it shows up. I found this chart made by a Unitarian Universalist to be interesting. They show a two-way split at Chalcedon, as well as the East-West Schism, but they also show Pentecostals coming exclusively from Methodists, and Restorationists, including Mormons, coming out of the Reformed tradition, which are problematic claims. People who are trying to learn about denominations often look to charts like these as educational helps. They simplify the complex history of splits and schisms from entire books into lines on a piece of paper. And that can be helpful, but it also glosses over many things. Here's some of those things. Which side in the division was smaller? which side in the division looks theologically most similar to the original group. I mention this because often those who exit do so because they still teach what the denomination did originally, but the majority changed into teaching something different. Was the division a break in communion between two pre-existing structures, or the formation of new structures? But one of the biggest things glossed over in these charts is the following question: was it really a split at all? You see, everyone wants to point to where a denomination came from. So, for example, when people talk about Seventh-day Adventists, they want to have a clear place to put them on the chart. Where did Adventists come from? This chart from BibleTruths.org says Adventists came from Baptists with the date of 1844, but one must also realize that SDAs are only one part of Adventism, their church forming in 1863 from the broader Adventist movement, which itself developed from the followers of William Miller, who predicted the return of Christ would be in 1843 and then in 1844. Miller was a Baptist, but Miller never started a denomination, never believed in a seventh-day Sabbath, and never was part of the SDA church. The people who formed Adventism came from many different denominations, some Baptist, others Congregationalist or Methodist, others from denominations that no longer exist like the Christian Connection. I'll be honest, to put Adventism as a fork off from Baptists is an error. It's incorrect. You can't list them as a clear fork off of any one denomination. They formed with new theology that in some cases borrowed heavily from other groups, but this is not the same as a split. There was not a set of Baptist churches that left a Baptist denomination and became Adventists. The same chart shows Church of Christ as a split from Baptists in 1801. In 1801, one of the two main leaders of the Restoration movement, Barton Stone, participated in the Cane Ridge Revival. At the time, Stone was a Presbyterian minister. Alexander Campbell, the other big name, had also been a Presbyterian. However, Campbell was later baptized by a Baptist minister and had his church run as a Baptist church for a while before realizing that his theology was irreconcilably at odds with the Baptists. Stone and Campbell's movements merged and used the names of Christian churches and Churches of Christ. Now, many in the Church of Christ movement will tell you that Stone and Campbell just were influential in the Restoration movement, leading to people to reject denominationalism and simply be part of the Church of Christ, which itself was already in existence since Christ started his church in the first century. I'm not going to examine that here, but if we were to accept the disputed claim that the Churches of Christ have their origin in Stone and Campbell, can we really say that the Churches of Christ are a split from the Baptists? Stone and Campbell were both at one time Presbyterian. Campbell's church for a time was with the Baptists, but uncomfortably so, and ultimately left off calling themselves that because they had never been what the Baptists were. But like Adventists, their movement pulled people from every which way, and was not a large group of existing historically Baptist congregations leaving for a new identity. Another clear example of this is the Baptists themselves. Like Churches of Christ, some Baptists claim their churches have been around since Christ, but under different names, often claiming the Anabaptists, Waldenses, Paulicians, Donatists, Albigenses, and others as Proto-Baptists. But everyone agrees that the name of Baptist for these churches has not been in perpetual use. So where did the first Baptists who used the name come from? Most point to Thomas Helwys and John Smith as the origin of General Baptists. Smith was an Anglican at first, then discovered Anabaptists in Holland, where his theology developed. There, he and Thomas Helwys started a church. Smith later converted with part of the church to being Mennonite, and Helwys and others from the church went to England to found the first church with the name of Baptist in that country in 1613. So do Baptists then originate as a split from Anglicanism? No Anglican churches became Baptist to start the denomination. No Anglican ministers started Baptist churches. Smith was no longer Anglican in any sense when he helped organize a Baptist church. In fact, if anything, the Smith-Helwys line of churches could be viewed as originating in Anabaptism, as it was the influence of Anabaptism that made them accept the doctrines which Baptists hold so closely. But even that is a stretch. If Smith did start the Baptists started with Smith, not as a split from Anglicans or Mennonites. It was something new, and not a schism from any other denomination. What's interesting is that particular Baptists or Calvinistic Baptists formed completely separately. That is, it's not that Baptists started as Arminians and the Calvinists split off, or Calvinists and the Arminians split off. Two entirely separate groups with similar convictions on baptism chose the name of Baptist but share no history together. The particular Baptists originate in John Spilsbury leaving a separatist church based on his convictions on believers' baptism and starting the first particular Baptist congregation. Once again, No Anglican churches became Baptist. There was no split in the Anglicans there, but Baptists came into being out of nonconformism and separatism from the established church. So when denomination charts show Baptists coming from Anglicans, the same way that Lutherans came from Catholics, and that sometimes shown as the same way that Oriental Orthodox came from the so-called Great Church, it seems like more than a generalization. It seems nearly arbitrary. If John Smith had decided to attend a Reformed church for a week, would we all be putting Baptist as a split from Reformed now? The idea of a split makes sense when a group of congregations leaves one denomination for another, but when one person explicitly rejects the teaching of their denomination, and then at some point down the line that person starts churches from scratch, often with entirely different beliefs, the connection to their old denomination is tentative at best. Maybe that's why these chart makers can't really decide where to put Baptists. This one shows them as a Reformed branch, this one says they came from the Anabaptists, and this one says from the Puritans. In fact, the details on any of these denomination origin stories are contested enough that I expect if you scroll down, you'll find more than a few arguments over how I've represented them. And if that helps you to take a second look at these denomination origin charts and view them with more skepticism, then I think my job here is done. If you like my videos on denominations, please consider supporting me at readytoharvest.com.